Okay, you're on.
All right, cool. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of What's the Tea? This segment is going to be a little bit different from the rest because we are streaming live. So you viewers will have the opportunity to go ahead and comment below whatever questions you have, anything you want us to talk about. You can go ahead and comment below. We have our tech guy, Zach. He will be helping us making sure that this is streaming live on Facebook. He's also going to be our time management guy, and he is going to keep an eye out for all these questions. So we will make sure to get to them before this episode is over. So today I'm going to be spilling the tea with one of our very own executive directors, Jennifer Gabrania. And so if you can go ahead and introduce yourself, Jennifer, just tell us a little bit about you and maybe the work you do, why you got into this work.
Sure. So, hey, everyone, this is Jennifer. You hear me sometimes on Facebook. I introduce myself in posts as your friendly neighborhood executive director. My background is, I'll try to make it super short. I always tell people I've been doing this since I was 12 years old. So I got started doing anti-violence work back when I was in college. I had to take a class, and in the process of taking this class on women and violence, they talked a lot about domestic violence. And in learning about that, I recognized that the family that I grew up in was a family that had domestic violence happening, and kind of had this epiphany of, oh, wow, that's what that was. That's what was happening. And learning that set the course, for the next 20 some years of my life, and pretty much decided at that point that was something that I wanted to do something about. I primarily came into the work on the prevention side of things. So that's really where my passion is, doing prevention with little kids. My first job was, 3-year-olds, talking to 3-year-olds about keeping themselves safe, all the way up through high school kids and talking to people in the community. So I kept on that course and just kind of bounced around in different areas of anti-violence work until I landed here at South Suburban Family Shelter about 4 years ago. So my work here looks a whole lot different than it did when I started out talking to little kids. My work here really is to support all of the folks that do our direct service work. So our mission is to provide comprehensive coordinated services to families impacted by domestic abuse, and then also within the community. So I see myself as kind of supporting our hierarchy of client services, right? So people tend to think of a hierarchy as you have your ED up here at the top and it flows down. And I think of it as flipped the other way. So I kind of see myself down, holding everything up, trying to make sure that everybody has everything that they have, so that ultimately at the end of the day, the clients and the communities get what they need to address the domestic violence that's occurring, and then to try to stop future domestic violence from happening.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. I think a lot of us can relate to where when we do start learning about domestic violence, then we start thinking, wow, well, that's what it was that was happening. My whole life I would see this, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So I can relate to that as well. So moving on, there has been, we all know, everybody in the world knows, there's been a lot of changes that have been happening lately. There's been the pandemic, and there's been a lot going on. So our lives have changed. Some of us have lost their jobs. Some of us continue to work from home. But even those who do continue on their day-to-day job don't do the same work they used to do, because a lot has changed. So if you can just give us a brief overview of how your work has recently changed.
Oh my gosh, it's been so, and this is my home. So you can see all my stuff behind me. I'm in my home office. I'm going to hope that my kid doesn't come through the door and interrupt the Facebook Live. He knows that I'm doing this, so I'm going to hope that he stays out there. So really for me, I think back to, for us, it really all started on March 16th. So we're now almost 3 months into this, when we were all told everybody who can stay home should stay home. And that obviously isn't the way that our agency works on a regular basis. We have always, as an agency, over the last couple of years, more and more allowed some folks to work from home, because work-life balance is extremely important to us at South Suburban Family Shelter. Being an agency that works with folks who've been traumatized, we know that that also impacts our staff. So it was a little bit easier for us to make the shift because the idea of people working from home wasn't brand new to us. But the idea of providing counseling from home was something we had never considered. So that was really difficult. We had to take all of our programs. And for those who are watching that don't know, we have 7 direct service programs in addition to the administration and development that we have. And they all operate differently and they all do things differently. So we can't have a one size fits all for how we modify our programs. So we had to go through and take each individual program and figure out how we were going to work with them. And it would take up our whole session if I went through the way that we did that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's what we needed to do. Obviously, people who weren't client facing, we immediately were able to have those folks figure out as much as they could do to work from home. And the ones that were client facing, you know, our program managers were just amazing and immediately started thinking, how can we do this from remote? What can we put into place to serve people? I would say the biggest thing that happened, though, that we have shared publicly with folks is the shift that had to happen in emergency shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, some of you might not know, I find this is the big secret of South Suburban Family Shelter that I always tell people. We don't have a residential shelter, even though a lot of you think that we do. So our emergency shelter is provided through scattered site, which means it's not all under one roof. And we typically do that for folks that are in a very dire emergency, only need 1 or 2 days. And our goal is always to move them on to a longer term place for them to get their needs met. In this situation, because of all of the concerns around COVID-19, many of those longer term shelters that we would work with were no longer bringing people into their shelters. They were actually emptying their shelters out to put people into hotel-based sheltering. And so we no longer had all of those other places that we could send the clients that we would typically serve. So our shelter placements have increased by over 500% since the end of March, which I can't tell you, it's huge. We went from people typically staying with us 2 nights to people staying with us up to a month. Our longest person stayed with us for 2 months over this time in a hotel. So it's incredibly expensive. It's an expense that we obviously didn't plan on doing. And we weren't set up with our service model to provide longer term services. However, we have a fabulous, amazing staff. And without anyone having to say anything, they all jumped together and started working as a team. So our counseling staff started working with our shelter staff and how they could provide virtual counseling to people that were going to be in shelter for longer term. Our housing staff started working with our sheltering staff to figure out, okay, who's eligible for longer term housing? We have transitional housing and rapid rehousing, and who's eligible for those programs, and can we work to move into those programs? So it was absolutely amazing to observe how our staff shifted on a dime, and they just did it so seamlessly. They just knew what needed to be done and they started doing it. So I'd have to say that for me was something that gave me so much hope and encouragement. Yes. Even though we're in difficult times, right? To see how amazing our staff have been. And you saw that, Celeste, same thing, right? Like, holy cow, look at what they were able to do.
Yeah, look at what the whole staff was able to do. I also want to mention how much I appreciate, the agency itself and all the decisions that were made and how they prioritize staff as well as clients and giving us the opportunity to continue working and working from home. I think that was something that alleviated me a lot, because a lot of people are afraid of losing their job and not having this income anymore. And we didn't have that to worry about. Everyone in the agency is still trying to provide services just as much as they used to be, if not more.
Yeah, there are definitely some folks that are working more than ever. We unfortunately have some programs that they operate out of places that we don't own and operate. Right. So for instance, we have a medical advocacy program that operates out of health institutions. Right now, they can't do their job because of COVID-19. Our medical providers are like, we don't want anyone coming in that isn't, already part of the medical staff. And so we're sitting here and waiting, and they really want to do their job and they miss doing their job, but we're on hold right now to be able to provide that service again. And one of the very first things that we did, the leadership within the organization and the board of directors agreed right away, was to create a mechanism so that we could continue keeping all of our staff on and paying them their full wages. So we haven't lost a single staff member during this time frame. We've actually hired a couple. So we had somebody who their first day was the very first day of the stay-at-home order, which was interesting for us because we had to stop for a second and say, wait a minute, how do you onboard somebody that you don't get to see? But we have learned that our staff is our greatest asset as an agency. And over again, we know how much we appreciate them. And we also know what it's like to try to rehire great qualified people who care about this cause. We want to keep everybody as much as we possibly can. So that's been a long-term goal of ours over these last 3 months.
Okay, thank you for all that information. I do want to move on a little bit and talk about, we've talked about a lot of the changes that are going on. We've talked about the pandemic. There's also been a lot of violence going on, some racist murders that have been happening. So this violence that we've been seeing lately, we all know it's nothing new. It's something that we've seen several times before. It's been happening for a really long time. What does look a little bit different is the way that people are reacting. So do you have an opinion or an idea of why do you think people are reacting differently to this?
So it's interesting, right? We're going through this pandemic. Everyone is already experiencing what we call collective trauma, right? People's schedules are stopped. We have the highest unemployment rate that we've ever had, which means people don't know where to get their basic needs met. We haven't figured that out yet. So we are in the middle of a huge global traumatic event right now. And then what happens is, like you said, right, these incidents are not new. It's not like they've never been going on, but in pretty short succession, we hear media coverage of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery while he's jogging in his neighborhood, the killing of Breonna Taylor while she is sleeping in her apartment, when her partner tries to defend the house because of someone breaks in and they don't know who it is. And we've learned that that's the police. And then the murder of George Floyd. All of these quick succession, we've got some video of some of them, and they're completely heart-wrenching and gut-punching. And there's a whole huge sector of our society, people of color, who are like, yeah, this happens to us all the time. This is why we're afraid to jog in our neighborhoods. What's different, what you're kind of referring to is this, we're seeing an outrage that's different than what we've seen before. And we're seeing a whole lot more white people like myself coming out and saying, this is not okay. And there's some questions like, well, where were all the white people before? Because this isn't new. This behavior isn't new. This has been happening. This is why, and you're seeing it a lot more in social media, a lot of moms, Black moms saying, yeah, well, I've always talking to my kids about this. I have to talk to my son who is Black. I'm scared for him. And I have rules, or I have ways in which I educate him to be safe in America because of the racism and the white supremacy that exists. So that's what we're seeing that's different now. And it's kind of hard to figure out, where is that coming from and what has changed from the last time. There are various points in time, right, where there's been a lot of heavy media coverage of the killing of a Black person, and this type of outrage or this type of taking to the streets didn't always occur.
Yeah, exactly. And how exactly do you think that this type of situation, people's reactions, maybe even a lot of these people might be experiencing trauma due to, several years of being oppressed? How does this relate to our work that we do at our agency and domestic violence?
So one of the things that that we know all of the time as domestic violence providers, particularly when you're working with communities of color, is that as a domestic violence community, we kind of came up in DV work and pretty quickly started to rely on criminal justice response, something that required the police and law enforcement to be involved, which then requires that people have to trust and want to use that resource. That doesn't work. in a lot of the communities that we serve, because the people that we're talking to, the Black women that we might be serving, don't necessarily want to call the police in their community because of what the ramifications could be for their partner that they're calling the police on. What some people don't always understand in a domestic violence situation is a lot of people who are being victimized or are being hurt in that situation, they want the abuse to stop. They don't want to be hurt anymore. They don't always want that person to go away. They don't always want that person to be punished necessarily or put in jail. They want to not be hurt anymore.
Exactly.
They don't want the police coming to the house and end up killing this person.
Exactly. And I'd like to talk a little bit about why it's so important in a job like this, when we're working with people who have been affected by violence, to be trauma informed, because there might be a lot of things bothering a person. There might be so many things underneath a person that you don't know what exactly is going on.
Yeah.
But we are running a little bit low on time. One more question I would like to ask is, as a leader, how do you provide support for your staff as well as your clients who might be going through a really hard time right now during this difficult time?
Yeah, so as a leader, sometimes it's hard to figure out what the right thing to do or the right thing to say is. What I
Yeah.
try to always keep in mind from a trauma-informed perspective is that my staff are very often going through their own traumas. Everybody at South Suburban Family Shelter, are very often going through their own traumas. Our staff are impacted by the traumas that they're working with. And so I want to be thinking from a trauma-informed lens, always encouraging our staff to take care of themselves, always encouraging our staff to take the time that they need, making sure that we put policies and procedures in place where people feel like they can do that. If someone needs to take a day off, take a day off. Don't
Yeah.
push yourself too hard. At the end of the day, we know that our staff are whole people. They aren't just the 8 hours a day that they're coming to South Suburban Family Shelter. They're a whole entire person. And as much as we can honor that, that's what we want to do. That's the ways in which we want to support the folks, because when we do that, you all bring your best work to us, and that's all it is that we want. So that's kind of a quick and dirty about how
Yeah.
we support staff. But I mean, when it comes to the end of the day, our staff are people, and so we just want to treat our staff like people, human beings. And I just feel like having compassion and understanding goes a long way.
Yeah. I myself appreciate this compassion and understanding. I felt it. I needed it. In a time where, after the murder of George Floyd, I wasn't able to focus on work. I was sitting here in front of my computer and I didn't know what it was that I was supposed to be doing. I was thinking about, how do I explain to my children what is going on? How do I make sure that they understand the situation at 5 years old and not be part of the problem? So there's a lot going on through our heads that we can't exactly focus on. But when I did get that email from you, something as simple as an email really did alleviate, my day. So that email basically said, take as many breaks as you want today. And it really did make me feel better. So I do want to say how much I appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Zach and see if we have any questions on the comments.
All right, great job so far. We do have a few questions on the Facebook. More people have been following in as the video has been happening. So
Okay.
first question, and I know we've touched on the first two questions a little bit, but if there's anything else you might want to say, what can communities do in this moment to help alleviate trauma? And also, how do we recognize trauma?
Oh, those are good questions. I'm going to start with the recognizing trauma, which can be really difficult to do. Trauma comes in all different kinds of forms. It can be impacted, we're specifically talking about the trauma from domestic violence, but trauma in of itself is the experience of something that overwhelms your typical coping mechanisms, right? We all have ways that we cope with stress. A traumatic event is something that overwhelms the typical way in which you cope with your stress. So often when we talk about trauma, it is the kinds of things that you think you're going to die, or that you might die, or that your life is in danger in some kind of a way, and you don't know how to respond to that. when you're working much more closely with someone, it might be easier to figure out that someone's having a trauma response. But when you're driving through, McDonald's to pick up, your food, and someone's treating you in a certain kind of way, it's harder to know that that may be rooted in a trauma response. So that brings me, I think, back more to that first piece of the question around how can you be in community and supportive in the community around trauma. And to me, it's always trying to take a step back and realize that you never know the story that the person across from you is carrying with them. You never know if the way in which they're reacting to you is rooted within a trauma that they've experienced. And if they are coming from a place where they're potentially triggered, or if they're coming from a place where they always have to have their guard up and treat others in a way in which to keep themselves safe. So it's kind of like thinking it's not about you. Other people's reactions to you, for the most part, aren't about you. It's about something that's going on with them. And so we do need to be able to pull back and be self-reflective. And this is a hard place to be, because sometimes people say things to you that really don't feel good when they're coming from a place of deep hurt and trauma, and it's difficult to not jump to feeling defensive. But you
Yeah.
have to be able to take a deep breath and realize that for the most part it's not about you. And so that's a starting place, I would say, because it's obviously a learning process, and none of us who have studied trauma or looked into it are great at it all the time. We all make mistakes, and we all mess up, and we all have times where we get defensive based on what somebody's bringing to us. And I've had plenty of times where I've had to go back and then apologize to somebody because I realized I reacted out of a place that just wasn't constructive. It wasn't helpful to the moment, and it wasn't going to move us to the next place.
Yeah. And that's how you grow, when you realize you said something that offended somebody and you apologize and you take into account that what you said was wrong. That's exactly how you grow. And those are really, really strong words. It's definitely important to be self-reflective. That's one of the most important things when it comes to these types of situations. Do we have any other questions on there, Zach?
We have two more questions. The first one, we did touch on it, but I will just repeat it. And if anything's left unsaid, we can cover it. And that is, how is South Suburban Family Shelter contributing to anti-racist activism in the context of our DV services?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So one of the things that we're currently doing right now, one of our coworkers, one of our leadership director team members, I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, prompted me as I was thinking about making a Facebook post about after George Floyd was murdered, and what our perspective was. She reached out to me and said, "Hey, you need to say something to the staff." And I so appreciate that she did that, because she really reminded me that we have to keep our house in order. We have to take care of each other before we reach out to the community. So we've been doing that internally, having those conversations and talking about what happened and what that means. And I personally have had to understand that I talk about that from a place of white leadership. So I'm already have white privilege as a white person, and I'm in this executive director role. So I have the privileges of my position of being an executive director. So having to talk very honestly from that position. And we made a decision also then to take some responsibility to our community, to put materials out there about white privilege, white supremacy, and anti-racism through our social media outlets. So that's one thing that we're doing on that point. I think as an organization, we've always tried to be as intentional as possible in how we're serving the community. We try to hire people that mirror the folks in the community that we serve, because we know that people feel really comfortable talking to somebody who looks like them, or somebody that has experiences similar to theirs. So as an agency, we've always been intentional about doing that. I've always really tried to come at leadership and the way that we run the agency and put together our policies and procedures to think of, are we unintentionally impacting people of color by what we're doing? Because for me, I'm not automatically going to think of that because I'm here as a white person. So it's not going to be automatic for me to think from that point of view. So it takes a lot of reflection and intentionality is an agency to go about that. And so once again, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. But continuing to be open to learning and to changing and growing.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something that I've definitely noticed about our agency. What else do we have, Zach?
Okay, two more questions if you would like to take them. They're a little bit more straightforward. One is, what's the biggest misconception about domestic violence?
Huh.
Oh, the biggest one.
There are so many.
I was going to say there's a lot of misconceptions. I think the biggest one, okay, this is my perspective, and then I want to hear what Celeste has to say.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that the person who's being in the hurt in the relationship wants that relationship to end and they want to leave the relationship.
You said the person who's being hurt?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is everyone who's kind of on the outside thinks that that person who's being hurt wants the relationship to end and wants to leave the relationship all the time.
Okay. I'm having a hard time choosing one, but I think that a lot of people believe that it was the victim's fault. A lot of people believe that whatever the victim is doing, they looked for it, or they like what's going on, or they have no problem with the situation, so they shouldn't interfere and they shouldn't try to help because they feel like there's nothing they can do. This person, chose their own situation. And I think that is really, really important for somebody to step in, even if it's just giving them information, giving them a simple brochure or a phone number to call. That might be, the last string that the person just needed to call and get help, because nobody deserves that. Nobody looks for a situation like that.
Yeah. And I think to expound on mine a little bit, we have quite a few people who choose not to leave the relationship. They love this person. They got into the relationship with the person that they're with because they love them. They don't want to leave the relationship for maybe a variety of reasons. What they want is to not be hurt anymore. And sometimes that's what the work centers on, is how that's going to be minimized as much as possible. So we have quite a few people who don't choose to leave the relationship, and we don't tell them that they have to. That's not our decision to make for them.
Yeah, without imposing anyone's solution. So a lot of people think that the only resolution to this is leaving the relationship, but we do have different solutions. We have the partner abuser intervention program, we have counseling, so there are other alternatives. One more question, Zach?
How could someone in the community help South Suburban Family Shelter?
All kinds of ways you can help South Suburban Family Shelter. I think one of the biggest ways, of course, is sharing, knowing what our hotline number is and sharing that with people. So we can put that down maybe in the comments, Zach, you can type in what the hotline number is so that people can see it. I know that our community's been great about sharing the hotline number. Another way that the community can help is, again, through various types of donations. One thing that our community, our Facebook family in particular, is phenomenal at is when we put requests out on Facebook for items that our clients need to move into a new apartment, or for the food pantry that we keep in the counseling office. You all reply immediately, and you reply so much that sometimes we have to ask you to stop bringing it because we don't have anywhere else to put it. So you're amazing at that. And then obviously it's monetary donations. We are funded through a variety of different sources. But I think what people don't know is that a lot of the grants and the dollars that we get, they support direct client services, but they don't support the things that are behind the scenes. They don't support the things that are required for the business to function, because we are a nonprofit, but we are a business. So we do have things like human resources, and we do have functions like finance and administration. And a lot of our established funders don't pay for things like that. They won't pay for the light in my office because I'm the executive director and I'm not providing counseling. But I think you all want me to have a light in my office so I can see what I'm doing. So those are the kinds of things that we do. And we also always want to plan for the future, and being able to have this, we call it non-restricted dollars, right? That we can use it in any kind of way. We want to always be able to think about what's the best possible way that we can achieve our mission, and be able to be flexible and pivot to that whenever we need to, instead of having to wait 1 year for a funder to give us a new grant. We want to be able to always be evolving and always be growing. And that's the kind of thing that allows us to do that.
Yeah, very strong words, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the information that you've given us, for the strong words that you've given us. I really appreciate it. I want to say thank you to all the viewers. If there's any questions that you still want to ask, you can make sure to comment them and we'll make sure to answer those questions for you. Thanks, Zach, for doing all the technology things here that God knows I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to technology, so I don't know what I'm doing without you.
Yeah, and thanks to our, I
Yeah.
want to thank our community education team. They're another team that pivoted pretty quickly, from being in the schools the majority of their day to being at home and trying to figure out how to serve the community differently. So this is their brainchild. So thanks for joining us and helping us to grow and innovate in our department.
Okay, great. So no problem. If you're interested in learning more about South Suburban Family Shelter, tune in next week as we spill the tea with our very own partner abuser intervention facilitators. So thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Please like our page, comment, and share. Bye.